Chapter 4 of Dr. Nikola's Experiment by Guy Boothby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. The night on which I discovered that Nikola's drugs had been stolen was destined to prove unpleasant in more senses than one. The sweetest tempered of men could scarcely have failed to take offence had they been treated as the captain had treated me. I told him in so many words, and with as much emphasis as I was master of, that I had distinctly seen the Chinaman standing upon the main deck of his steamer. The second engineer had also entered the same report. His evidence, however, while serving to corroborate my assertion, was of little further use to me, inasmuch I had still better proof that what I said was correct, namely, that the medicines were missing. Under the circumstances, it was small wonder that I slept badly. Even had the cabin been as large as a hotel bedroom, and the bunk the latest invention in the way of comfortable couches, it is scarcely possible I should have had better rest. As it was, the knowledge that I had been outwitted was sufficient to keep me tumbling and tossing to and fro from the moment I laid my head upon the pillow till the sun was streaming in through my porthole next morning. Again and again I went over the events of the previous day, recalling every incident with photographic distinctness, but always returning to the same point. How the man could have obtained admittance to the saloon at all was more than I could understand, and having got there, why he should have stolen the bottles of medicine, when there were so many other articles which would have been of infinitely more value to him scattered about, was, to say the least, incomprehensible. Hour after hour I puzzled over it, and at the end was no nearer a solution of the enigma than at the beginning. At first I felt inclined to believe that I must have taken them from the bag myself, and for security's sake had placed them elsewhere. A few moments' search, however, was sufficient to knock the bottom out of that theory. Hunt high and low where I would, I could discover no traces of the queer little bottles. Then I remembered that when I had sent the steward forward for them to the Don's cabin the previous afternoon, I had taken them from the bag and placed them upon the deck beside the old man's bunk. Could I have left them there? On reconsidering the matter more carefully, however, I remembered that before leaving the cabin I had replaced them in my bag, and that as I carried them back to my berth I had dumped the satchel against the corner of the saloon table. I was afraid that I might have broken them. So this effectually disposed of that theory too. At least the suspense or irritation, by whichever name you may describe it, became unbearable, and unable to remain in bed any longer. I rose, dressed myself, and prepared to go on deck. Entering the saloon, I found the steward busied over a number of coffee cups. "Good morning, sir," he said, looking up from his work. "If you'll excuse me my saying so, sir, you're about early." "I was late in bed," I answered, with peculiar significance. "How is it, my friend, that you allow people who have no right there to enter the saloon to thieve from passengers' cabins?" "To thieve, sir?" the man replied, with a startled tone. "I'm sure I don't understand you, sir. I allow no one to enter the saloon when there has no right to be there." I glanced at him sharply, wondering whether the fellow was as innocent as he pretended to be. "At any rate," I said, "the fact remains that someone entered my cabin last night while I was on deck and stole the medicines with which I am treating the old gentleman in the cabin yonder." The man looked inexpressibly shocked. "God bless my soul alive, sir, you don't mean that," he said with a falter in his voice. Surely you don't mean it." "But I do mean it," I answered. "There can be no sort of doubt about it. When I left the old gentleman's cabin yesterday, I carried the bag containing the medicines back with me to my own berth, locked it, and hung it upon the peg inside the looking-glass with my own hands. After that I went on deck, returned to my cabin an hour or so later, opened the bag, and the bottles were gone." "But, sir, have you any idea who could have taken them?" the man replied. "I hope you don't think, sir, how I should have allowed such a thing to take place in this saloon without my knowledge." "I hope you would not," I answered, "but that does not alter the fact that the things are missing. But don't you think, sir, the young lady herself might have come in search of you, and when she found you were not there, did the next best thing and took away the medicines to use herself?" At present I do not know what to think, I replied with some hesitation, for that view of the case had not presented itself to me. But if there had been anything underhand going on, I think I can promise the culprit that it will be made exceedingly hot for him when we reach our destination. Having fired this parting shot, I left him to the contemplation of his coffee cups and made my way up the companion ladder to the deck above. It was a lovely morning, a brisk breeze was blowing, and the steamer was running fairly steady under a staysail and a foresail. It was not the sort of morning to feel depressed, and yet the incidents of the previous night were a little uncomfortable. Nikola had trusted me, and in the matter of the medications at least I had been found wanting. I believed at the moment I would have given all I possessed, which was certainly not much, but still a good deal to me, to have been able to solve the mystery that surrounded the disappearance of those drugs. Shortly before 8 bells, the skipper emerged from the chart room and came along the hurricane deck towards the poop. Seeing me, he waved his hand, and after he had descended the ladder from the main deck, bade me good morning. "I'm afraid our accommodation is not very good," he said, "but I trust you have passed a fairly comfortable night. No more dreams of one-eared Chinaman, I hope." From the tone in which he spoke, it was plain that he imagined I must have been dreaming on the previous evening. Had it not been for the seriousness of my position with Nikola, I could have laughed aloud when I thought of the shell I was about to drop into the skipper's camp. "Dreams or no dreams, Captain Windover," I replied, "I have to make a very serious complaint to you. It will remain then for you to say whether you consider that the assertion I made to you last night was, or was not, founded upon fact. As I believe you are aware, I was instructed by my principal, Dr. Nikola, to join this vessel in the Thames, and to take charge of Don Miguel de Moreno until his arrival in Newcastle on time. Dr. Nikola was fully aware of the difficulty and responsibility of the task he had assigned to me, and for this reason he furnished me with a number of very rare drugs, which I was to administer to the patient as occasion demanded. In the letter of instructions which I received prior to embarking, I was particularly warned to beware of a certain Chinaman, whose peculiar characteristic was that he had lost half an ear. In due course I joined your vessel, and attended the Don, using the drugs to which I have referred, and afterwards returned them to my cabin. A quarter of an hour or so later I made my way to the deck, where I found myself suddenly brought face to face with the Asiatic of whom I had been warned. On the recommendation of the chief engineer, I reported the matter to you. You searched the ship, found no one at all like the man I described, and from that time forward set down the story I had told you either as a fabrication on my part or the creation of a dream." "Pardon me, my dear sir, not a fabrication," the skipper began, "only a—" "Pardon me in your turn," I replied. "I have not quite finished. As I have inferred, you treat the matter with contempt. What is the result? I return to my cabin, and before retiring to rest, in order to make sure that they are ready at hand in case I shall require them during the night, open the bag in which the medicines until that moment have been stored. To my consternation, they are not there. Some one had entered my cabin during my absence and stolen them. I leave you to put what construction on it you please, and to say who that some one was." The captain's face was a study. But he began. "Buts will not end the matter," I answered, I'm afraid rather sharply. "There can be no getting away from the fact that they are gone, and that some one must have taken them. They could scarcely walk away by themselves. But supposing your suspicions to be correct, what possible use could a few small bottles of an unknown medicine be to a man like a Chinaman? Had he taken your watch and chain or your money, I could understand it. But from what you say, I gather that nothing else is missing." "Nothing else," I replied, in the tone of a man who is making an admission that is scarcely likely to add to the weight of the argument he is endeavouring to adduce. "Besides," continued the skipper, "there are 100 other ways in which the things might have been lost or mislaid. Last night the ship was rolling heavily. Why might they not have tumbled out and have slipped under your bunk behind your bags? I've known things like that occur." "And would the ship have closed the bag again, may I ask?" And would the ship have closed the bag again, may I ask? I answered scornfully. No, no, Captain, I'm afraid that won't do. The man I reported to you last night, the one-eared Chinaman, is aboard your ship, and, for some reason best known to himself, has stolen some of my property, therefore not only inconveniencing me, but placing in absolute danger the life of the old man whom I was sent on board to take care of. As the thief is scarcely likely to have jumped overboard, he must be on board now, and as he would not be likely to have stolen the bottles only to smash them, it stands to reason that he must have them in his keeping at the present moment. And suppose he has, what do you want me to do? I want you to find him for me, I answered, or if you don't care to take the trouble to put sufficient men at my disposal, and allow me to do so. On hearing this, the captain became very red and shifted uneasily on his feet. My dear sir, he said a little testily, much as I would like to put myself out to serve you, I must confess that what you ask seems a little unreasonable. Don't I tell you I have already searched the ship twice in an attempt to find this man, and each time without success. Upon my word, I don't think it's fair to ask me to do so again. In that case, I am very much afraid I have no alternative to make a complaint to you in writing, and to hold you responsible should Don Miguel de Moreno lose his life through this robbery which has been committed, and which you will not help me to set right. What the captain would have answered in reply to this I cannot say. It is quite certain, however, that it would have been something sharp, had not the Dofia Consuelo made her appearance from the companion hatch at that moment. She struck me as looking very pale, as if she had passed a bad night. The skipper and I went forward together to meet her. "Good morning," I said, as I took the little hand she held out to me. "I hope your great-grandfather is better this morning." "He has passed a fairly good night, and is sleeping quietly at present," she answered. "The steward is sitting with him now, while I come up for a few moments to get a little fresh air on deck." The skipper made some remark about the beauty of the morning, and while he was speaking I watched the girl's face. There was an expression upon it I did not quite understand. "I am afraid you have not passed a very good night," I said, after the other had finished. "Yesterday's anxiety must have set you more than you allowed me to suppose." "I will confess that it did upset me," she answered, with her pretty foreign accent, and the expressive gesticulation which was so becoming to her. "I've had a wretched night. I had such a terrible dream that I have scarcely recovered from it yet." "I am sorry to hear that," the skipper and I answered almost together, while I added, "Pray tell us about it." "It does not seem very much to tell," she answered, "and yet the effect of it produced upon me is just as vivid now as it was then. After you left the cabin last night, Dr. Ingleby, I sat for a little while by my grandfather's side, trying to read, but finding that impossible. I retired to rest, lying upon the bed. The steward is kind enough to make up for me upon the floor. I was utterly worn out, and almost as soon as I closed my eyes I fell asleep. How long I had been sleeping I cannot say, but suddenly I felt there was someone in the room who was watching me. Who it was I could not tell, but that it was someone or something utterly repulsive to me I felt certain. In vain I endeavoured to open my eyes, but, as in most nightmares, I found it impossible to do so. And all the time I could feel this loathsome thing, whatever it was, drawing closer and closer to me. Then, putting forth a great effort, I managed to wake, or perhaps to dream that I did so. I had much better have kept my eyes closed, for leaning over me was the most horrible face I have ever seen or imagined. It was flatter than that of a European, with small narrow eyes and such cruel eyes. "Good heavens!" I cried, unable to keep silence any longer. "Can it be possible that you saw him too?" Meanwhile the skipper, who had been leaning against the bulwarks, his hand thrust deep in his pockets and his cap upon the back of his head, suddenly sprang to attention. "Can you remember anything else about the man?" he inquired. The girl considered for a moment. "I do not know that I can," she answered. "I can only repeat what I have said before, that it was the most awful face I have ever seen in my life. Stay, there is one thing that I remember. I noticed that half his left ear was missing." "It's the Chinaman!" I cried, with an air of triumph that I could no longer suppress, and as I said it, I took from my pocket the letter of instruction Nikola had sent me the week before. and read aloud the passage in which he referred to the one-eared Chinaman of whom I was to beware. The effect was exactly what I imagined it would be. "Do you mean to tell me I was not dreaming after all?" the Donna inquired, with a frightened expression on her face. "That is exactly what I do mean," I answered. "I am glad to have your evidence that you saw the man, for the reason that it bears out what I have been saying to our friend the captain here." Then turning to that individual, I continued, "I hope, sir, you will now see the advisability of instituting another search for this man. If I were in your place, I would turn the ship inside out, truck to keelson, as it seems to me outrageous that a rascal like this can hide himself on board, and you, the captain, be ignorant of his whereabouts." "There is no necessity to instruct me in my duty," he answered, and then going to the companion, called down it for the steward, who presently made his appearance on deck. "Williams," said the skipper, "Dr. Ingleby informs me that a theft was committed in his cabin last night. He declares that a man made his way into the saloon, visiting not only his berth, but that of Don Miguel de Moreno. How do you account for this?" "Dr. Ingleby did say something to me about it this morning, sir," the steward replied. "But to tell you the plain truth, sir, I don't exactly know what to think of it. It's the first time I've ever known such a thing happen. Of course, I shouldn't like to say as how Dr. Ingleby was mistaken." "You had better not," I replied so sharply that the man jumped with surprise. "Anyway, sir," the steward continued, "I feel certain that if the man had come aft I should have heard him. I'm a light sleeper, as the saying is, and I believe that a cat coming down the companion ladder would be enough to waken me, much less a man." "On this occasion you must have slept sounder than usual," I said. "At any rate, the fact remains that the man did come, and I have asked you once more, Captain, what you intend to do to find my stolen property." "I must take time to consider the matter," the captain replied. "If the man is aboard the ship, as you assert, I will find him, and if I do find him, he'd better look out for squalls, so that's all I can say. And at the same time," I added, "I hope you will severely punish any member of your crew who may have been instrumental in secreting him on board." As I said this, I glanced at the steward, and it seemed to me that his always sallow face became even paler than usual. "You need not bother yourself about that," said the skipper. "You may be sure I shall do so." Then lifting his cap to Dona Consuelo, he went forward along the deck, while the steward, having informed us that breakfast was upon the table, returned to the companion ladder and disappeared below. "What does all this mystery mean, Dr. Ingleby?" inquired my companion, as we turned and walked aft together. "It means there is more at the back of it than meets the eye," I replied. "Before I left London I was warned by Dr. Nikola, as you heard me say just now, to beware of a certain Asiatic with only half an ear. What Nikola had feared he would do I have no notion, but there seems to be no doubt that this is the man." "But he has done us no harm," she replied, "beyond frightening me. So if the captain takes care that he does not come as far as the saloon again, it does not seem to me that we need think any more about him." "But he has done us harm," I asserted, "grievous harm. He has stolen the medication with which I treated your great-grandfather so successfully yesterday." On hearing this she gave a little start. "Do you mean that if he should become ill again, the same way that he did yesterday, you would be unable to save him?" she inquired, almost breathlessly. "I cannot say anything about that," I answered. "I should, of course, do my best, but I must confess the loss of those drugs is a very serious matter for me. They are exceedingly valuable, and were specially entrusted to my care." "And you think that Dr. Nikola will be angry with you for having lost them?" she said. "I am very much afraid he will," I answered. "But if he is, I must put up with it. But let us now come below to breakfast." With that I led her along the deck and down the companion ladder to the saloon. "Before we sit down to our meal, I think it would perhaps be as well if I saw your great-grandfather," I said. "I should like to convince myself that he is none the worse for his attack yesterday." Upon this we entered the cabin together. I bent over the recumbent figure of the old man. He lay just as he had done on the previous day. His long thin hands were clasped upon his breast, and his eyes looked upward just as I remembered seeing them. For all the difference that was to be seen, he might have never moved since I had left him so many hours before. "He is awake," whispered his great-granddaughter, who had looked at him over my shoulder. Then, raising her voice a little, she continued, still in English, "This is Dr. Ingleby, grandfather, whom your friend Dr. Nikola has sent to take care of you." "I thank you, sir, for your kindness," replied the old man, in a voice that was a little louder than a whisper. "You must forgive me if my reception of you appears somewhat discourteous, but I am very feeble. A month ago I celebrated my 98th birthday, and at such an age, I venture to assert, much may be forgiven a man." "Pray do not apologise," I replied. "I am indeed glad to find you looking so much better this morning." "If to be still alive is to be better, then I suppose I must be," he answered in a tone that was almost one of regret, and then continued, "The days of our age are 80 and 10. And though men be so strong that they come to 80 years, yet is their strength but labour and sorrow, labour and sorrow, aye, labour and sorrow." "Come, come, sir," I said, "you must not talk like this. You are not very comfortable here, but we are nearly at our journey's end. Once there, you will be able to rest more quietly and in greater comfort than it is possible for you to do in this tiny cabin." "You speak well," he answered, "when you say that I am nearly at my journey's end. God knows I am near it, very, very near it. The wonder is I have not reached it long since. But it will come at last, and when it does I shall rest, as you say, more quietly than in this tiny cabin." Seeing that in his present humour there was not much to be done with him, I completed my examination and gave certain instructions to his great-granddaughter, and then left the cabin feeling very much as if I had stepped into the 19th out of another and quite different century. Breakfast was laid in the saloon, and as the steward informed me that the skipper invariably had his sent forward to the chart room, while the Donna Consuelo usually partook of hers by the old gentleman's bedside, I sat down to it alone. The steward waited upon me a trifle nervously, I thought, and with an obsequiousness that told me he was anxious to make up to me for the robbery of the night before. Whatever he might think, however, I had not the smallest intention of allowing myself to be drawn into a discussion with him on the subject. The matter would have to be settled some way or another when we reached our destination, and then, in all probability, Nikola would look after it for himself. Whatever else may be said of the good ship Donna Mercedes, her warmest admirers could scarcely assert that she possessed a wonderful turn of speed. Even with everything in her favour, it was as much as the chief engineer could do to knock 9 knots out of her. But on the present occasion 7 was somewhere near her mark. For this reason, instead of reaching our destination at midday, as I had hoped we would do, night had closed in upon us before we had crossed the bar, and could count ourselves safely in the river, while 5 bells in the first watch had been sounded before we lay at anchor in the Tyneside. As soon as I heard the cable rattling out through the hawse hole, I made my way back to the deck. The night was a dark one, and a more interesting picture than I had before me then could scarcely be imagined. Around me on every side were ships, colliers, tramps, passenger vessels, and merchantmen of every possible sort and description. The lights of the city could be plainly distinguished, and innumerable tongues of fire containing all the colours of the rainbow flashed up continually from factory chimneys. A couple of steam launches were lying alongside, with at least a dozen small boats, and thinking Nikola might be in one of them, I went forward to the gangway in search of him. But though I scanned the faces below me, his was not among them, for the reason that we were so late getting into the river, and knowing that the vessel would be likely to remain for some time to come, I argued that in all probability he had been put off boarding her until the morning. I accordingly turned away and was about to walk aft when a hand was placed on my shoulder. "Well, friend Ingleby," said a voice that there was no mistaking, and which I should have known anywhere, "what sort of a voyage have you had, and how is your patient progressing?" "Dr. Nikola!" I cried in astonishment as I turned and found him standing before me. "I was just looking for you in the boats alongside. I had no idea you were on board." "I came up by the other gangway," Nikola replied. "But you have not answered my question. How is your patient?" "He is still alive," I answered, "and I fancy, if possible, a little better than when we left London. But he is so feeble that to speak of his being well seems almost a sarcasm. Yesterday, for a few moments, I thought he was gone, but with the help of the drugs you gave me, I managed to bring him round again. This morning he was strong enough to converse with me." "I am pleased to hear it," he replied. "You have done admirably, and I congratulate you. Now we must think about their transshipment." "Transshipment?" I replied. "Is it possible they have to make another journey?" "It is more than possible." "It is quite certain," he answered. "Allerdeyne Castle is a matter of some 50 miles up the coast, and a steam yacht will take us there. A bed has been prepared for the old gentleman in the saloon, and all we have to do is to get him off this boat and on board her. You'd better let me have those drugs, and I'll mix him up a slight stimulus. He'll need it." This was the question I had been dreading all along, but the die was cast, and willy-nilly the position had to be faced. "I should like to speak to you upon that matter," I said. "I very much fear that you will consider me to blame for not having exercised greater care over them, but I had no idea they would be of any value to any one who did not know the use of them." "Pray, what do you mean?" he asked with a look of astonishment that I believe was more than half assumed. "To what are you alluding? Have you had an accident with the drugs?" While we had been talking we had walked along the main deck, and were approaching the entrance leading therefrom to the cubby, the light from which fell upon his face. There was a look upon it that I did not like. When he was in an affable mood, Nikola's countenance was singularly prepossessing. When, however, he was put out by anything, it was the face of a devil rather than a man. "I exceedingly regret having to inform you that last night the drugs in question were stolen from my cabin." In a moment he was all excitement. "By the man of whom I bade you beware, of course, the one-eared Chinaman?" "The same," I answered, and went on to inform him of all that had transpired since my arrival on board, including my trouble with the captain, and the suspicions I entertained, without much foundation, I'm afraid, against the steward. He heard me out without speaking, and when I had finished bade me wait on deck while he went below to the Moreno's cabin. While he was gone I strolled to the side and once more stood watching the lights reflected in the water below. On an old tramp steamer, a short distance astern of us, a man was singing. It was one of Chevalier's Costa songs, and I could recognise the words quite distinctly. The last time I had heard that song was in Cape Coast Castle, just after I had recovered from my attack of fever, and I was still pursuing the train of thought it conjured up, when I noticed a boat drawing into the circle of light to which I have just alluded. It contained 2 men, one of whom was standing up while the other rowed. A second or two later they had come close enough to me to see the face of the man in the bows. To my amazement he was a Chinaman. So overwhelming was my astonishment that I uttered an involuntary cry, and running to the skylight called to Nikola to come on deck. Then bounding to the bulwarks again, I looked for the boat, but it was too late. Either they had achieved their object, or my prompt action had given them a fright. At any rate they were gone. "What do you want?" cried Nikola, who by this time had reached the deck. "The Chinaman," I cried. "I saw one of them a moment ago in a boat alongside." "Where are they now?" he inquired. "I cannot see them. They have disappeared into the darkness again. But when I called to you they were scarcely 20 yards away. What does their presence here signify, do you think?" "It signifies that they know I am on board," answered Nikola, with a queer sort of smile upon his face. "It means also that, although this is the 19th century and law-abiding land of England, if we were to venture a little out of the beaten track ashore to-night, you and I would stand a very fair chance of having our throats cut before morning. It has one other meaning, and that is that you and I must play the old game of the partridge in its nest, and lure them away from this boat while the skipper transfers Don Miguel and his great-granddaughter to the yacht I have waiting down the river." "That's all very well," I interrupted, "but I'm not at all sure the skipper would be willing. To put it bluntly, he and I have already had a few words together over this matter." "That will make no difference," Nikola answered. "I assure you, you need have no fear that he will play us false. He knows me far too well to attempt that. I will confer with him at once, and while I am doing so, you had better get your traps together. We will then go ashore and do our best to draw these rascals off the scent." So saying, Nikola made his way forward towards the chart room, while I went through the cuddy to my own berth. The steward carried my bags out onto the main deck, After I had spoken a word or two with Donna Consuelo, I followed him. 5 minutes later Nikola joined me, accompanied by the captain. I had bidden the latter good-bye earlier in the evening, and Nikola was giving him one last word of advice, when I happened to glance towards the alleyway on the port side. Imagine my surprise, nay, I might almost say my consternation, on beholding, standing in the dark by the corner of the main hatch, the same mysterious Chinaman who I had felt certain had committed the robbery of the drugs the previous night. "Look, look!" I cried to my companions. "See, there is the man again." They wheeled round and looked in the direction to which I pointed. At the same time the man's right arm went up, and from where I stood I could see something glittering in the palm. An inspiration, how or by what occasion I shall never be able to understand, induced me to seize Nikola by the arm, to swing him behind me. It was well that I did so, for almost before we could realise what was happening, a knife was thrown, and stood embedded a good 3 inches in the bulwark, exactly behind where Nikola had been standing an instant before. And springing to the ladder which leads from the main to the hurricane deck, he raced up it, jumped onto the rail, and dived headlong into the water alongside. By the time we reached the deck whence he had taken his departure, all we could see was a boat pulling swiftly in the direction of the shore. "That settles it, friend Ingleby," said Nikola. "We have no alternative now but to make our way ashore and do as I proposed. If you are ready, come along. I think I can safely promise you an adventure." End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Dr. Nicola's Experiment by Guy Boothby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. When, nowadays, I look back upon the period I spent in Nicola's company, one significant fact always strikes me, and that is the enormous number of risks we managed to cram into such a comparatively short space of time. During my somewhat chequered career, I have perhaps seen as much of what it is vaguely termed life as most men. I have lived in countries the very reverse of civilized. I have served aboard ships where there has been a good deal more sandbagging and hazing than would be considered good for the average man's Christian temperament. And as for actual fighting, well, I've seen enough of that to have learnt one lesson, one which will probably cause a smile to rise on the face of the inexperienced, and that is to keep out of it as far as possible, and on all occasions to be afraid of firearms. I concluded my last chapter with an account of our arrival in Newcastle, and explained how we were preparing to go ashore, when the one-eared Chinaman, who I felt convinced had committed the robbery of the previous night, made his appearance before us, and came within an ace of taking Nikola's life. Had it not been for my presence of mind, or instinct, or whichever term you please to call it, I verily believe it would have been the end of all things for the doctor. As it was, however, the knife missed its mark, and a moment later the man had sprung up the ladder into the hurricane deck, and leapt the rail and plunged into the river. Being desirous of preventing the Chinaman from following us, and by that means becoming aware that we were leaving for the north in Nikola's yacht, we determined to make our way ashore and permit them to suppose we were remaining in Newcastle for some length of time. Accordingly, we descended into the wherry alongside, and ordered the boatman to pull us to the nearest landing stage. "Keep your eyes open and your wits about you," whispered Nikola, when we had left the boat and were making our way up to the street. "They are certain to be on the lookout for us." As you may be sure, I did not neglect his warning. I had one exhibition of that diabolical celestial skill in knife throwing, and when I reflected that in a big town like Newcastle there were many dark corners and alleyways, and also that a knife makes but little or no noise when thrown, I was more determined than ever to neglect no opportunity of looking after my own safety. When we reached the street at the rear of the docks, Nikola cast about him for a cab, but for some minutes not one was to be seen. At last a small boy obtained one for us. When the luggage had been placed on the roof, we took our seats in it. Nikola gave the driver his instructions, and in a short time we were bowling along in the direction of our hotel. Throughout the drive I could see no signs of the enemy. I was in the act of wondering how such a game as we were then playing could possibly help us if the Celestials had failed to see us come ashore, when Nikola turned to me and in his usual quiet voice said, "I wonder if you've noticed that we are being followed?" I replied that I certainly had not, nor could I see how he could tell such a thing. "Very easily," he said. "I will prove that what I say is correct. Do you remember the small boy who went in search of a cab?" I answered that I did, whereupon he bade me examine our reflection as we passed the next shop window. I did so, and could plainly distinguish a small figure seated on the rail at the back. Save this atom, ourselves, and a solitary policeman, the street was deserted. "I do see a small boy," I answered, "but may he not be coming with us to try and obtain the job of carrying our luggage?" "He is engaged upon another now. When he came up from the river he was on the lookout for us, although, as you may have noticed, he pretended to be asleep in a doorway. He obtained the cab for us. As you stepped into it, he ranged up alongside and handed something to the driver. When we alight, he will wait to see that our luggage is carried in, after which he will decamp and carry the information to his employers, who will endeavour to cut our throats as soon as the opportunity occurs." "You took the matter in an eminently cheerful light," I said. "For my own part, I have no desire to give them the chance just yet. Is there no way in which we can prevent such a possibility occurring?" "It is for that reason that we are here," Nikola replied. "I can assure you that I am no more anxious to die than you are. There would be a good deal of irony in having perfected a scheme for prolonging life, only to meet one's death at the hand of a Chinese ruffian in a civilized English town." "Then what is your plan?" I inquired. "I will tell you, but do not let us speak so loud. Little pitchers have long ears. My notion is that we make for the hotel, the name of which I was careful to give the driver in hearing of the boy, and we will engage a couple of rooms there, order breakfast to-morrow morning, still in the hearing of the boy, and afterwards get out of the way as quietly as possible." "Sounds feasible enough," I replied, "if only we can do it. But do you think the men will be so easily fooled?" "Well, that remains to be proved. However, we shall very soon find out." "A pretty sort of thing you've let yourself in for, Master Ingleby," I thought to myself as Nikola lapsed into silence once more. "A week ago you were starving in a back street of London. Now it looks very much as if you're going to be murdered in affluence in Newcastle. However, you've let yourself in for it, and have only yourself to blame for the result." Consoling myself in this philosophic way, I held my peace until the cab drew up before the hostelry to which my companion had alluded. As soon as we were at a standstill, Nikola alighted, went into the hotel to inquire about rooms. As we agreed, I remained in the cab until he returned. "It's all right, Ingleby," he cried, as he crossed the pavement again. "They're very full, but we can have the rooms until the day after to-morrow. After that we must look elsewhere. Now let us get the traps inside." The porter emerged and took our luggage, and we accompanied him into the building. As we did so, I saw the ragged urchin who had ridden behind the cab draw nearer the portico. The manager received us in the hall. "Numbers 59 and 60, he said to the porter. "Would you care for any supper, gentlemen?" We thanked him, but declined, and then followed the porter upstairs into the rooms in question. Having seen my luggage safely installed, and the man on his way downstairs, Nikola showed himself ready for business. "When you get into these sort of scrapes," he said, "it's just as well to have a good memory. I know these rooms of old, and directly I saw the position we were in, I thought they might prove of use to us. When I once did the manager a good turn, and when I explain matters to him, he will understand why we have taken up our abode with him, only to leave again so suddenly. Have you a sheet of notepaper and an envelope in your bag?" I produced them for him, whereupon he wrote a note, and having placed a banknote inside, addressed it to his friend. "I'll leave it on the chimney-piece, where the chambermaid will be certain to see it," he said. "I have told the manager that we are obliged to leave in this unceremonious fashion, in order to rid ourselves of some unpleasant fellow travellers who have been following us about, with what I can only think must be hostile intent. Until your return, I have asked him to take charge of your baggage, so that you need have no fear on that score. I'm sorry you should have to lose it, but I can lend you anything you may require until you get possession of it again. Now, if we can only get outside of this window and down to the Tyneside once more, without being seen, I think we may safely say we have given Quon Ma the slip for good and all." So saying, he crossed the room and threw open the window. "We're both active men," Nikola continued, "and should experience small difficulty in dropping down to the roof of the outhouse below. Thence we can make our way along the wall to the back. Are you ready?" "Quite ready," I answered, whereupon he crawled out of the window, and holding on by both hands, lowered himself until his feet were only a yard or so above the roof of the outhouse to which he had referred. Then he let go and dropped. I followed his example, after which we made our way in Indian file along the wall, past the stables, and dropped without adventure into the dark lane at the rear of the hotel. It's the first time in my life I'd left a building of that description in such an unceremonious fashion. Yet, strangely enough, I remember, it caused me no surprise. In Nikola's company, the most extraordinary performances seemed commonplace and in the natural order of things. "From now forward we must proceed with the greatest caution," said my companion, as we regained our feet and paused before making our way down the dark lane towards a small street at the further end. "They are scarcely likely to watch the back of the hotel, but it will be safer for us to suppose them to be doing so." Acting up to this decision, we proceeded with as much caution as if every shadow were an enemy and every doorway contained a villainous celestial. We saw nothing of the men we feared, however, and eventually reached the thoroughfare leading to the docks without further adventure. But fortunate as we had so far been, we were not destined to get away as successfully as we had hoped to do. We were within sight of the river when something, I cannot now remember what, induced me to look back. I did so just in time to catch a glimpse of a figure emerging from the shadow of a tall building. At any other time such a circumstance would have given rise to no suspicion in my mind. But, worked up to such a pitch as I was then, I seemed gifted with an unerring instinct that told me as plainly as any words that the man in question was following us, and that he was the Chinaman we were so anxious to avoid. I pointed him out to Nikola and asked whether he agreed with me as to the man's identity. "We will soon decide that point," was his reply. "Slacken your pace for a moment, and when I give the word, wheel sharply round and walk towards him." We executed this manoeuvre and began to walk quickly back in the direction we had come. The mysterious figure was still making its way along the darker side of the street, and our suspicions were soon confirmed, for on seeing us he turned also, and a few seconds later disappeared down a side street. "He's spying on us, sure enough," said Nikola, "and I do not see how we are going to baffle him. Let's hasten on to the river and trust to luck to get on board the yacht without his finding out where we have gone." Once more we turned ourselves about, and in something less than 5 minutes had reached the landing place for which we were steering. Then, pulling a whistle from his pocket, Nikola blew 3 sharp notes upon it. An answer came from the deck of the yacht out in the stream. It had scarcely died away before a boat put off from alongside the craft and came swiftly towards us. "It's only a question of minutes now," said Nikola, throwing a hasty glance around him. "Time versus the Chinaman. If I am not mistaken," here the boat drew up at the steps, "time has the best of it. Come along, my friend, let us get on board." I followed him down the steps and took my place in the dinghy. The men pulling bent to their oars, and we shot out into the stream. "Look," said Nikola, pointing to the place we had just left. "I thought our friend would not be very far behind us." I followed with my eyes the direction in which he pointed, and sure enough I could just distinguish a dark figure standing upon the steps. "They would like to catch me if they could," observed the doctor, with a shrug of his shoulders and one of his peculiar laughs. "If they've tried once, they've done so 100 times. I will do them the credit of saying that their plans have been admirably laid, but fate has stood by me, and on each occasion they have miscarried. They tried at first at Ya Chow Fu, then at I Chang, afterwards in Shanghai, Rangoon, Bombay, London, Paris, and St. Petersburg, and I can't tell you how many other places, but as you see they have not succeeded so far." "But why should they do it?" I asked. "What is the reason of it all?" "That is too long a story for me to tell you now," he replied, as the boat drew up at the accommodation ladder. "You shall hear it another day. Our object now must be to get away from Newcastle without further loss of time." I followed him along the deck to where a short, stout man stood waiting to receive us. "Are you ready, Stevens?" asked Nikola. "All ready, sir," the other replied, with the brevity of a man who is not accustomed to waste his words. "In that case, let us start quickly as possible." "At once," the man replied, and immediately went forward, while Nikola conducted me down a prettily arranged and constructed companion ladder to the saloon below. As we reached it, I heard the tinkle of the telegraph from the bridge to the engine room, and almost simultaneously the screw began to revolve, and we were under way. After the darkness outside, the brilliant light of the saloon in which we now stood was so dazzling that I failed to notice the fact that a bed place had been made up behind the butt of the mizzenmast. Upon this lay the old Don, and seated by his side and holding his hand was the Dona Consuelo. "My dear young lady," said Nikola in his kindest manner, as he advanced toward her, "I fear you must be worn out. However, we are under way again now, and I have instructed my servant to prepare a cabin for you, in which I trust you will be fairly comfortable." Dona Consuelo had risen and was standing looking into his face as if she were frightened of something he was about to say. "I am not at all tired," she said. "I would far rather remain here with my great-grandfather." "As you wish," answered Nikola abstractedly. Then stooping, he raised the old man's left hand and felt his pulse. The long, thin fingers of the doctor, indicative of his extraordinary skill as a surgeon, seemed to twine round the other's emaciated wrist, while his face wore a look I have never seen upon it before. It was that of the born enthusiast, the man who loves his profession more than aught else in the world. While, however, I was observing Nikola, you must not suppose I was regardless of the Dona Consuelo. To a student of character, the expression upon her face could scarcely have been anything but interesting. While Nikola was conducting his examination, she watched him, as if she dreaded what he might do next. Fear there was in abundance, but of admiration for the man I could discover no trace. The examination concluded. Nikola addressed 2 or 3 pertinent questions to her concerning her great-grandfather's health during the voyage, which she answered with corresponding clearness and conciseness. The old man himself, however, though conscious, did not utter a word, but lay staring up the skylight above his head, just as I had seen him do on board the steamship Dona Mercedes. Fully 5 hours must have elapsed before we reached our destination. Indeed, day had broken, and the sun was in the act of rising, when a gentle tapping upon the skylight overhead warned Nikola that our voyage was nearly at an end. Leaving the old man in his great-granddaughter's care, Nikola signed me to follow him to the deck. "It may interest you to see your future home," he said, as we stepped out of the companion into the cool morning air and looked out over the sea, which the rim of the newly risen sun was burnishing until it shone like polished silver. At the moment the yacht was entering a small bay surrounded by giant cliffs, against which the great rollers of the North Sea broke continuously. The bay itself was of deep shadow, and was as dreary as a place as any I have seen. I looked about me for a dwelling of any sort, but not a sign of such a thing could I discover, only a long stretch of frowning cliff and desolate wind-swept tableland. "At first glance it does not look inviting," said Nikola with a smile upon his face, as he noticed the expression upon mine. "I confess I have seen a more hospitable coastline, but never one better fitted for the work we have in hand." "But I do not see the castle," I replied. "I have looked in every direction, but can discover no trace of it." "One of its charms," he continued triumphantly. "You cannot see it, because at present it is hidden by yonder headland. When we are safely in the bay, however, you will have a good view of it. It is a fine old building, and in bygone days must have been a place of considerable importance. Ships innumerable have gone to pieces in sight of its turrets, while deep down its own foundations, I am told, there are dungeons enough to imprison half the county. See, we are opening up the bay now, and in 5 minutes shall be at anchor. I wonder what result we shall have achieved when we next steam between these heads." While he was speaking, we had passed from the open sea into the still water of the bay, and the yacht was slowing down perceptibly. Gradually the picture unfolded itself, until, standing out in bold relief upon the cliffs, like some grim sentinel of the past, the castle, for which some time to come at least was destined to be my home, came into view. Who its architect had been I was never able to discover, but he must have been impregnated with the desolation and solemn grandeur of the coast, and in his building have tried to equal it. As Nikola had said, a place better fitted for the work we had to do could not have been discovered in the length and breadth of England. The nearest village was upwards of 12 miles distant. Farms or dwelling house there were none within view of its towers. Tourists seldom ventured near it, for the reason that it was not only a place difficult of approach, but, what was perhaps more of importance, because there was nothing of interest to be seen when you reached it. As I gazed at it, I thought of the girl in the saloon below, and wondered what her feelings would be, and what her life would be like in such a dismal place. I glanced at Nikola, who was gazing up at the grim walls with such rapt attention that it was easy to see his thoughts were far away. Then the telegraph sounded, and the screw ceased to revolve. The spell was broken, and we were recalled to the realities of the moment. "I was miles away," said Nikola, looking round at me. "I could see you were," I answered. "You'd be very surprised if you knew of what I was thinking," he continued. "I was recalling a place not unlike this, but 10,000 miles or more away. It is a monastery, similarly situated on the top of enormous cliffs. It was there that I obtained the secret which is the backbone of the discovery we are about to test. I have been in some queer places in my time, but never such a one as that. But we haven't time to talk of that now. What we have to do is get the old man ashore and up to yonder building. If anything were to happen to him now, I think it would break my heart." "And his great-granddaughter's also," I put in. "You must admit she is devoted to him." He threw a quick glance at me, as if he were trying to discern how far I was interested in the beautiful girl in the saloon below. Whatever conclusion he may have come to, however, he said nothing to me upon the subject. Having ordered the captain to see the boat, which had been specially prepared for the work of carrying the old gentleman ashore, brought alongside, he made his way to the saloon, and I accompanied him. "We have reached our destination, Dona Consuelo," he said, as he approached the bed beside which she was sitting. As he spoke, there leapt into her eyes the same look of terror I had noticed before. It reminded me more than anything else of the expression one sees in the eyes of a rabbit when the snare has closed upon it. As I noticed it for the first time since I had known him, a feeling of hatred for Nikola came over me. It was not until we were in the boat and were making our way ashore that I found the opportunity of speaking to her without Nikola overhearing us. "Courage, my dear young lady, courage," I said. "Believe me, there is nothing to fear. I will pledge my life for your safety." She gave me a look of gratitude, and stooped as if to arrange the heavy travelling rug covering her aged relative. In reality, I believe it was to hide the tears with which her eyes were filled. From that moment there existed an indefinable, real bond between us, and though I did not realize it at the moment, the first mark had been made upon the chain with which Nikola imagined he had bound me to him. On reaching that side of the bay on which there was a short strip of beach, the boat was grounded. The 4 sailors immediately took up the litter upon which the old man lay and carried it ashore. The path up to the castle was a steep and narrow one, and the work of conveying him to the top was by no means easy. Eventually, however, it was accomplished, and we stood before the entrance to the castle. Moat there was none, but in place of it, spanned by the drawbridge, a ponderous affair, something like 50 feet long by 10 wide, was an enormous chasm going sheer down in one drop fully 200 feet. At the bottom water could be seen, and at night when the tide came in, the gurgling and moaning which rose from it was sufficient to appal the stoutest heart. "Welcome to Allerdeyne Castle," said Nikola as we crossed the bridge and entered the archway of the ancient keep. Then, bending over the old man on the litter, he added, "When you cross this threshold again, my old friend, I hope you will be fully restored to health and strength." a young man again in every sense of the word. Dona Consuelo, I am all anxiety to hear your opinion of the apartments I have caused to be prepared for you." Moving in procession as before, we crossed the great courtyard, which echoed to the sound of our footsteps, and reaching a door on the farther side, entered and found ourselves standing in a well-proportioned hall, from which a staircase of solid stone, up which a dozen soldiers might have marched abreast, led to the floors above. With Nikola still in advance, we made the ascent, turned to the right hand, and proceeded along a corridor upwards of 50 yards in length, out of which opened a number of lofty rooms. Before the door of one of these Nikola paused. "This is the apartment I have set aside for your own particular use, my dear young lady," he said. And with that he threw open the door and showed us a large room, carpeted, curtained, and furnished in a fashion I was far from expecting to find in so sombre a building. "Should there be anything wanting," he said, "you will honour me by mentioning it, when I will do all that lies in my power to supply it." Her face was very pale, and her lips trembled a little as she faltered a question as to where her great-grandfather was to be domiciled. "I have come to the conclusion that, for the future, it would be better," said Nikola, speaking very slowly and distinctly, as if in anticipation of future trouble, "that you should entrust him to my care. Ingleby and I, between us, will make ourselves responsible for his safety, and you may rest assured we will see that no harm comes to him. You must endeavour to amuse yourself as best you can, consoling yourself with the knowledge that we are doing all that science can do for him." And as he said this, he smiled a little sarcastically, as if her reading of the word science would be likely to differ considerably from his. "But you surely do not mean that I am to give him up to you entirely?" she cried, this time in real terror. "You cannot be so cruel as to mean that. Oh, Dr. Nikola, I implore you not to take him altogether from me. I cannot bear it." "My dear young lady," said Nikola, a little more sternly than he had yet spoken, "in this matter you must be guided by me. I can brook no interference of any description. Surely you should know me well enough by this time to be aware of that." "But he is all I have to live for, all I have to love," the girl faltered. "Can you not make allowance for that?" Her voice was piteous in its pleading, and when I heard Nikola's chilling tones as he answered her, I could have found it in my heart to strike him. To have interfered at all, however, would have done no sort of good. So hard as it seemed, I was perforce compelled to hold my tongue. "If you love your great-grandfather," he said, "you will offer no opposition to my scheme. I will return him to you a different man. But we are wasting time, and these stone corridors are too cold and draughty for him. If you will be guided by me, you will rest a little after your exertions. There is an old woman below who shall come to you and do her best to make herself useful to you." Seeing that to protest further would be useless, the girl turned and went into the room, trying to stifle sobs that would not be kept back. The sight was one which would have grieved a harder heart than mine, and it hurt me the more because I knew that I was powerless to help her. All this time the 4 sailors who had carried the litter up from the beach had been silent spectators to the scene. Now they took up their burden once more and followed Nikola along the corridor, up some more steps, down still another passage, until I lost count of the way we had come. The greater portion of the castle had been allowed to fall into disrepair. Heavy masses of cobwebs stretched from wall to wall. A large proportion of the doors were even worm-eaten, and in some instances had even fallen in altogether, revealing desolate apartments in which the wind from the sea whistled, and the noise of the waves echoed with blood-curdling effect. Reaching the end of the second corridor, Nikola paused before a heavy curtain which was drawn closely from wall to wall, and ordered the men to set down their burden. They obeyed, and on being told to do so, took their departure with as much speed as they could put into the operation. If I know anything of the human face, they were not a little relieved at receiving permission to clear out of a place that had every right to be considered the abode of a certain old gentleman whom it scarcely becomes me to mention. When the sound of their footsteps had died away, Nikola drew back the curtain and displayed a plain but very strong wooden door. From the fact that the workmanship was almost new, I surmised that my host had placed it there himself, but for what purpose I could only conjecture. Taking a key from his pocket, he slipped it into the patent lock, turned the handle, and the door swung open. "Take up your end of the litter," he said, "and help me carry it inside." I did as I was ordered, and bearing the old man between us, we passed into that portion of the castle which, as I soon discovered, he had fitted up in readiness for the great experiment. Having passed the door, we found ourselves in a comparatively lofty room, or perhaps I'd better say hall, the walls of which were covered almost entirely with anatomical specimens. From what I could see of them, I should say that many were quite unique, while all were extremely valuable. Where and by what means he had collected them, I was never able to discover, though Nikola, on one or two occasions, threw out hints. There they were, however, and I promised myself that during my stay in the place I would use them for perfecting my own knowledge on the subject. At the end of the hall, looking over the sea, was a large window, while in either wall were several doors, all of which, like that in the corridor, were heavily curtained. The carpet was of cork, and quite noiseless. The lights were electric, the batteries and dynamos being in the room below. The heating arrangements were excellent, while the ventilation was of the most modern and improved description. I noticed that Nikola smiled a little contemptuously at my astonishment. "You were unprepared for this surprise," he said. "But let me give you a little piece of advice, and that is, never be astonished at anything you may see or hear while you are with me. The commonplace and I can assure you once and for all, do not live together. I have homes in all parts of the world. I am in England today, engaged upon one piece of work, and in 6 months' time I may be in India, Japan, Peru, Kamchatka, or, if you like it better, shall we say, playing tricks with niggers in Cape Coast Castle. But see, we are keeping our old friend waiting. I will find out if all the preparations I have ordered are complete. If so, we will convey him at once to the chamber set apart for him." With that he touched a bell, and almost before he had removed his finger from the button, a curtain at the farther end was drawn aside, and the same Chinese servant, the deaf and dumb individual, I mean, who had brought the letter to me at my lodgings in London the previous week, entered the room. Seeing his master, he bent himself double, and when he had resumed his upright posture, as curious a conversation commenced as I had ever known. I use the word conversation for the simple reason that I do not know how else to describe it. As a matter of fact, it was not a conversation at all, for the reason that not a word was spoken on either side. Their lips moved, but not a sound came from them, and yet they seemed quite able to understand one another. If, however, it was a strange performance, it had at least the merit of being an extremely successful one. "He tells me that everything is prepared," Nikola remarked, as the man crossed the room and drew back another curtain from a doorway on our left. "This is the room, but before we carry him into it, I think we had better have a little light upon the subject." To press the electric switch was the work of a moment, and as soon as this had been done, we once more took up our burden and carried it into the inner room. Prepared as I had been by the outer hall for something extraordinary, I was perhaps not so much surprised at the apartments in which I now found myself as I should otherwise have been, and yet it was sufficiently remarkable to fill any one with wonder. It was upwards of 20 feet in length, possibly 18 in width. The walls and the ceilings were as black as charcoal. When the electric light was extinguished, not a ray of anything would be visible. In the centre was a strange contrivance, which I could see was intended to serve as a bed, and for some other purpose which at the moment was not quite apparent to me. In the farther corners were a couple of queer-looking pieces of machinery, one of which reminded me somewhat of an unusually large electric battery. The other I could not understand at all. A machine twice the size of those usually employed for manufacturing ozone stood opposite the door. Thermometers of every sort and description were arranged at intervals along the walls, while on one side was an ingenious apparatus for heating the room, and on the other a similar one for cooling it. At the head and foot of the bed were two brass pillars, the construction and arrangements of which reminded me of electric terminals on an exaggerated scale. We placed the old gentleman on the bed. The litter was thereupon removed by the servant, and Nikola and I stood facing each other across the form of the man who was to prove or disprove the feasibility of the discovery of my extraordinary employer claimed to have made. For 24 hours, said Nikola, he must have absolute peace and quiet. Nothing must disturb him, nor must he take food. But is he capable, do you think, I asked, of going without nourishment for so long a time? Perfectly. On the draught I am about to administer him, he could do without it were such a thing necessary for a much longer period. Indeed, it would not hurt him if he were to eat nothing for a month. He left the room for a moment, and when he returned he carried in his hand a tiny phial of the same description, though much smaller, as those which had been stolen from me on board the steamer. It contained a thick red mixture, which, when he removed the stopper, threw off a highly pungent odour. He opened the mouth of the patient and poured upwards of a teaspoonful of it. As before, I expected to see some immediate result, but my curiosity was not gratified. Deftly arranging the bed coverings, Nikola inspected the thermometers, tested the hot and cold air apparatus, and then turned to me. He will require little or no supervision for some hours to come, he said, so we may safely leave him. To while away the time, if you care about it, I will show you something of my abode. I think I can promise you both instruction and amusement. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Dr. Nikola's Experiment by Guy Boothby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. Leaving the room in which we had placed Don Miguel de Moreno, as described in the previous chapter, we returned to the hall, the same in which was contained the magnificent collection of anatomical specimens already mentioned. Tired as I was, for it must be remembered that I had had but little sleep during the first night I had spent on board the Donna Mercedes, and none at all on that through which we had just passed. While I had a great deal of excitement and my fair share of hard work, I would not have lost the opportunity of exploring Nikola's quarters in this grim old castle for any consideration whatsoever. Nikola himself, though one would have scarcely thought it from his appearance, must have possessed a constitution of iron, for he seemed as fresh as when I first had seen him at Kelleran's house in London. There was a vitality about him, a briskness, and if I may so express it, an enjoyment of labour for its own sake, that I do not remember ever to have found in another man. As I was soon to discover, my description of him was not very wide of the mark. He would do the work of half a dozen men, and at the end be ready, and not only ready, but eager for more. In addition to this, I noticed another peculiarity about him. Unlike most people who are fond of work, he possessed an infinite fund of patience. He could wait for an issue, whatever it might be, to develop itself naturally, and unlike so many experimentalists, betrayed no desire to hurry it by the employment of extraneous means. In thus putting forward my reading of the most complex character that has ever come under my notice, I do so with an absolute freedom from bias. Indeed, you might almost say that I do so in great measure against my own inclinations, as will be apparent to you when you have finished my story. As I informed you in London, said this strange individual after he had closed the door of the patient's room behind him, had drawn the heavy curtains and switched off the electric light, I purchased this famous castle expressly for the experiment we are about to try. The owner, so my business people informed me, was amazed that I should want it at all. But then, you see, he did not understand its value. If I had searched the world, I could not have discovered a better. While we are near enough to civilization to be able to obtain anything we may require in the way of drugs or incidental apparatus, we have no prying neighbours. Such household stores as we require, the yacht brings us them direct from Newcastle. An old man and woman who take care of the place when I am absent have their quarters in the keep. My Chinese servant cooks for me personally and attends to the wants, which are not many, of the other people under my care. Other people under your care, I echoed. I had no idea there was anyone in the house save yourself and your servants. It's scarcely you would have any idea, he observed, seeing that no one knows of it save our Win, who for reasons you have seen is unable to talk about them, and myself, who would be even less likely to do so. Would you care to see them? I replied that I would very much like to do so, and he was about to lead me across the hall towards the door through which the Chinese servant had entered some little time before, when a curious circumstance happened. With a bound that was not unlike the spring of a tiger, an enormous cat, black as the pit of Tophet, jumped from the room and, approaching his master, rubbed himself backwards and forwards against his legs. Seeing my astonishment, Nikola condescended to explain. You're going to say that I can tell you that you have never seen such a cat as Apollyon. I don't suppose you have. If he could talk, he would be able to tell you some strange stories, would you not, old man? You've been my almost constant companion for many years, and more than once he has been the means of saving my life. Replacing Apollyon, whom he had picked up, on the floor, he conducted me towards the entrance of another corridor, which led in direction of the keep. Halfway down it was a rough iron gate, which was securely padlocked. Nikola undid it, and when we were on the other side, carefully relocked it after him. Though you may not think so, he said, these precautions are necessary. Some of my patients are extremely valuable, and I have not the least desire that they should escape from my keeping and fall over the battlements into the sea below. Follow me. I accompanied him towards yet another door, which he also unlocked. The scene which met my gaze as he threw it open, to employ a hackneyed phrase, beggars description. The room was about the same size as that was occupied by the Donna Consuelo, but it was not its proportions that amazed me, but its occupants. Accustomed as I had necessarily been by virtue of my profession to what are commonly called horrors, I found that I was not proof against what I had before me now. It was sufficient to make my blood run cold. Anything more gruesome could scarcely have been discovered or even imagined. Try to picture for yourself the inmates of a dozen freak museums, and the worst of monstrosities of which you have ever read or heard, and you will only have some dim notion of the folk whom Nikola so ironically called his patients. Some were like men, but not men as we know them. Some were like monkeys, but of a kind I had never seen before, which I sincerely hope I may never see again. There were things dull, flabby, faceless things, but there, I can go no further. To attempt to describe them to you in detail is a work of which my pen is quite incapable. A happy family, said Nikola, advancing into the room, and without exception devoted to their nurse, our Win yonder, who, as you are aware, in a measure shares their afflictions with them. Some day, if you care about it, I should be only too pleased to give you a lecture with demonstrations, such as you would get in no medical school in the world. Though I have attempted to set down this offer word for word, I have but the vaguest recollection of it, for long before he had finished speaking, I had staggered sick and faint with horror into the corridor outside. Not for the wealth of England would I have remained there a minute longer. To see these loathsome creatures fawning around Nikola, clutching at his legs and stroking his clothes, was too much for me, and I verily believed an hour in that room would have the effect of making me an idiot like themselves. A few moments later Nikola joined me in the passage. "You're very easily affected, my dear Ingleby," he said, with one of his peculiar smiles. "I should have thought your hospital experience would have endowed you with stronger nerves. My poor people in yonder—" Don't, I cried, holding up my hand in entreaty. "Don't speak to me of them. Don't let me think of them. If I do, I believe I shall go mad. My God, are you human that you can live with such things about you?" "I believe I am," he answered with the utmost coolness. "But why make such a fuss? Do like I do. Regard them from a scientific standpoint only. The poor things have come into this world handicapped by misfortune. I endeavour as far as possible to ameliorate their conditions, and in return they enable me to perfect my knowledge of the human frame as no other living man can hope to do. Of course I know there are people who look askance at me for keeping them. That doesn't trouble me. At one time they lived with me in Port Said, which, when you come to think of it, was a fit and proper place for such a hospital. Circumstances, however, combined to induce me to leave. Eventually we came here. Some time, if you care to hear it, I will tell you the story of their voyage home. It would interest you." I protested, however, that I desired to hear no more about them. I had both seen and heard too much already. That being so, Nikola led me along the passage and through the iron gate, which he locked behind him, as before, and so conducted me to the hall whence we had first set out. Once there, he went into a corner cabinet, and from it produced a decanter. Pouring me out a stiff glass of brandy, he bade me drink it. "You look as if you want it," he said, and heaven knows he was right. "And now," he said, when I had finished it, "if you will take my advice, you'll lie down for an hour or two. For the convenience of our work, I have arranged that you shall occupy a room near me. This is it. Should I want you, I will ring a bell." The room to which he alluded adjoined his own. It was situated at the far end of the hall, the door, like those of the others I have described, being concealed behind a curtain. Never was permission to retire more willingly accepted, and within 5 minutes of leaving him I was in bed and asleep. It must have been between 10 and 11 o'clock in the forenoon when I retired. The afternoon was well advanced before I woke again. Heavily as I slept, however, it had not been a restful slumber. All things considered, I had much better have been waking. Over and over again I saw the Dona Consuelo standing before me, just as she had done before Nikola that day. There was this difference, however. Instead of asking to be allowed to remain with her grandfather, their prayer was that I should save both him and her from Nikola. While she pleaded to me, the faces of the terrible creatures I had seen in that room down the passage peered at us from all sorts of hiding places. I had acceded to the Donna's request, and was flying from the castle, carrying her in my arms. At last, after I appeared to have been running for an eternity, we reached the shore, where I hoped to find a boat awaiting us, but not a sign of one was to be seen. While I waited, day broke, and I placed my burden on the sand, only to spring back from it with a cry of horror. It was not Dona Consuelo I had been carrying, but one of those loathsome creatures I had seen in that terrible room. A fit of rage came over me. I was about to wreak my vengeance on the unhappy idiot when I woke. I looked about me at the somewhat sparsely furnished room, and some seconds elapsed before I realized where I was. The memory of our arrival at the castle and all that had happened since returned to me. I shuddered, and had it not been for that poor girl, so lonely and friendless, I could have found it in my heart to wish myself back in London once more. Having dressed myself, I went out into the hall. Nikola was not there. I waited for some time, but as he did not put in an appearance, I left the room and made my way down the corridor in the direction of the Dona Consuelo's sitting room. Not being able to get an answer when I knocked, I continued my walk, ascended another flight of stairs, and eventually found myself upon the battlements. A better place for observing the construction of the castle and obtaining a view of surrounding country could not have been desired. On one side I could look away across the moorland towards a distant range of hills, on the other along the cliffs and across the wide expanse of sea. In the tiny bay to my right, the yacht which had brought us from Newcastle lay at anchor, and had it not been for that and a column of smoke rising from a chimney, I might have believed myself to be living in a world of my own. For some time I stood watching the panorama spread out before me. I was still looking at it when a soft footfall sounded on the stones behind me. I turned to find Dona Consuelo approaching me. She was dressed entirely in black, and wore a lace mantilla over her shoulders. "Thank heaven I have found you, Dr. Ingleby," she cried, as she hastened towards me. I began to think myself deserted by everybody. "Why should you do that?" I asked. "You know that could never be." "I am certain of nothing now," she answered. "You cannot imagine what I have been through to-day." "Indeed, I am sorry to hear you have been unhappy," I continued. "Is there any way I can be of service to you?" "There are many ways, but I fear you would not employ them," she replied. "I am hungering to be with my great-grandfather again. Can you tell me why Dr. Nikola takes him away from me?" "I fancied that he had told you," I answered. "But if it be any consolation to you, let me give you my assurance that he is being tenderly cared for. His comfort is secured in every way, and from what Dr. Nikola has said to me, and from what I have seen myself, I feel convinced he will be able to do what he has promised, and make your great-grandfather a hale and hearty man once more." "It's all very well for him to say that," she said, "but why am I not permitted to be with him? If he needs nursing, who would be likely to wait upon him so devotedly as the woman who loves him? Surely Dr. Nikola cannot imagine his secret would be unsafe with me if he reveals it to you, a rival in his own profession." "It's not that at all," I answered. "I do not fancy Nikola has given a moment's consideration to the safety of his secret." Then, seeing the loophole of escape she presented to me, I added, "From what you know of him, I should have thought you have understood that he has no great liking for your sex. To put it bluntly, Nikola is a woman-hater of the most determined order, and I fancy he would find it impossible to carry out his plans if you were in attendance upon the Don." "Ah, well, I suppose I must be content with your assurance," she said with a sigh. "For the present, I am very much afraid so," I replied. At this moment the old woman whom Nikola had appointed to wait upon us made her appearance, and informed the Donna that her dinner awaited her. About my own meals she knew nothing, so I concluded from this that I was to take them with Nikola in our own portion of the castle. Such proved to be the case, for when we reached the Donna Consuelo's apartments on the floor below, we met Nikola awaiting us in the corridor. "I have been looking for you, Ingleby," he said with a note of command in his voice. "You are quite ready for dinner, I have no doubt, and if you will accompany me, I think we shall find it waiting for us." As may be supposed, I would rather have partaken it with the Donna Consuelo, but as it was not to be, I bade her good morning, and was about to follow Nikola along the corridor, when he stopped, turned to the girl, and said, "I can see from your face that you have been worrying about your grandfather. I assure you, you have not the least cause to do so, and I think Ingleby here, if he has not done so already, will bear me out in what I say. The old gentleman is doing excellently, and almost before you know he has been taken away from you, you will have him back again." "Thank you for your news," she replied, but there was very little friendliness in her voice. "I would rather, however, see him and convince myself of the fact." Then, bowing to us, she retired to her own departments, while we made our way to the hall in search of our meal. "To-morrow morning," said Nikola, as we drew up our chairs to the table, "we must commence work in earnest. After that, for some weeks to come, I am afraid you will see but little of your fair friend down yonder. You seem to be on excellent terms with each other." As he said this, he shot a keen glance at me, as though he was desirous of discovering what was passing in my mind. I was quite prepared for him, however, and I answered in such an unconcerned way that I flattered myself, should he have got into his head that there was anything more than mere friendship in our intimacy, he would be immediately disabused of the notion. As he predicted, the following morning saw the commencement of that gigantic struggle with the forces of nature, upon the result of which Nikola had pinned so much faith, and which was destined, so he affirmed, to revolutionize the world. The most exhaustive preparations had been made. The duration of our watches in the sick room were duly apportioned, and a minute outline of the treatment proposed was propounded to me. On entering the dark room in which the old Don lay, I discovered that two bronze pedestals, the use of which had puzzled me so much on my first visit, had been moved near the bed, one being placed on its head and the other at its foot. These, Nikola pointed out to me, were the terminals of an electric conductor for producing a constant current, which was to play without intermission a few feet above the patient's head. A peculiar and penetrating smell filled the room, which I had no difficulty in recognizing as ozone, though Nikola's reason for using it in such a case was not at first apparent to me. The old Don himself lay just as we had left him the previous morning. His hands were by his sides, his eyes as usual were open, but saw nothing. It is not until I examined him closely that a slight respiratory movement was observable. "When I am not here," said Nikola, "it must be your business to see that this electric current is kept continually playing above him. It must not be permitted for an instant to abate 1 unit of its strength." Then, pointing to an instrument fixed at the further wall, he continued, "Here is a voltmeter with the maximum and minimum points plainly marked upon it. Your record must also include temperature, which you will take on these dry, wet thermometers once every quarter of an hour. The currents of hot and cold air you can regulate by means of these handles. The temperature of the patient himself must be noted once in every hour, and should on no account be permitted to get higher or lower than it is at the present moment." Taking a clinical thermometer from his pocket, he applied it, and when he had noted the result, handed it to me. If it rises 2 points above that before the same hour 3 days hence, he will die. No skill can save him. If it drops, well, in 80% of the cases the result will be the same. And suppose I detect a tendency to rise. In that case you must communicate instantly with me. Here is an electric button which will put you in touch with my room. I hope, however, that you will have no necessity to use it." Then, placing his hand upon my shoulder, he looked me full in the face. "Ingleby," he said, "you see how much trust I am placing in you. I tell you frankly, you have a great responsibility upon your shoulders. I am not going to beat about the bush with you. In this case there is no such thing as certainty. I have made the attempt 3 times before, and on each occasion my man has died simply through a moment's inattention on the part of my assistant. If the love of science and a proper appreciation of the compliment I have paid you in asking you to share with me the honour of this great discovery do not weigh with you, then think of the girl with whom you talked upon your battlements yesterday. You tried to make me believe that she was nothing to you. Some day, however, she may be. Remember what her grandfather's death would mean to her." "You need have no fear," I replied. "I assure you, you can trust me implicitly." "I do trust you," he answered. "Now let us get to work." So saying, he crossed the room and opened a square box, heavily clamped with iron, from which he took 2 china pots of ointment. Then, disrobing the old man, we anointed him with the most scrupulous care from head to foot. This we did 3 times, after which the second curious apparatus I had seen standing in the corner was wheeled up to the bedside. That it was an electrical instrument of some sort was plain, but what its specific use was I could not even conjecture. Nikola, however, very soon enlightened me upon the matter. Taking a number of large velvet pads, each of which was moulded to fit a definite position of the human body, he placed them in position, attached the wires that connected them with the machine, and when all was ready turned on the current. At first no effect was observable. In about a minute and a half, however, if my memory serves me, the usual deathly pallor of the skin gave place to a faint blush, which presently increased till the skin exhibited a healthy glow. Little by little the temporal veins, then so prominent, gradually disappeared. In half an hour, during which the current had been slowly and very gradually increased, another dressing of both ointments was applied. "Take this glass and examine his skin," said Nikola, whose eyes were gleaming with excitement as he handed me a powerful magnifying glass. When I bent over the patient and did as he directed, it was indeed a wonderful thing that I beheld. An hour before, the skin had been soft and hung in loose folds upon the bones, while the pressure of a finger upon it would not leave it up for upwards of any of a minute. Now it had, in a measure, regained its youthful elasticity, and upon my softly pinching it between my fingers, I found that it recovered its colour almost immediately. "It is wonderful," I whispered. "Had I not seen it myself, I would never have believed it." When it had been applied for an hour, the electric current was turned off and the pads removed. "Now watch what happens very closely," said Nikola, "for I assure you the effect is curious." Scarcely able to breathe by reason of my excitement, I watched, and as I did so, saw the flush of apparent health gradually decrease. The skin became white and loose once more, while the superficial veins rose into a prominence upon the temples. I glanced at Nikola, thinking that some mistake must have occurred, and that he would show signs of disappointment. This, however, he did not do. "You surely did not imagine," he said, when I had questioned him upon the subject, "that the effect I produced would be permanent on the first application. No, we may hope to achieve a more lasting result in a fortnight's time, but not till then. Meanwhile, the effect must be produced in the same fashion every 6 hours, both day and night. Now give me those rugs. We must cover him carefully. In his present state, the least draught would be fatal. Record the state of the voltmeter, read your thermometers, and see that your ventilating apparatus is working properly. As I said just now, should you need me, remember the bell. 1 ring when you have recorded your results will inform me that all is progressing satisfactorily, while 3 will immediately bring me to your assistance. Do you understand?" When I had assured him that I did, he left me. I accordingly switched off 3 of the electric lights, and sat myself down in a chair in semi-darkness, the centre of light being the patient on the bed. There was no fear of my feeling dull, for I had a great deal to think about. Taken altogether, the situation in which I found myself was as extraordinary as the most inveterate seeker after excitement could desire. Not a sound was to be heard. The stillness was that of the tomb. And yet I smiled to myself as I thought that if Nikola's experiment achieved the result he expected of it, the simile was not an appropriate one, for it was not the silence of the tomb, but of perpetual life itself. I looked at the figure on the bed before me and tried to picture what the mystery he was unravelling would mean to mankind. It was a solemn thought. Should the experiment prove successful, how would it affect the world? Would it prove a blessing or a curse? But the thoughts it conjured up were too vast, the issues too great, and to attempt to solve them was only to lose oneself in the fields of wildest conjecture. For 4 hours I remained on duty, noting all that occurred, reading my thermometers, regulating the hot and cold air apparatus, and at intervals signalling to Nikola that everything was progressing satisfactorily. When he relieved me, I retired to rest and slept like a top, too tired even to dream. Of what happened during the fortnight following, I have little to tell. Nikola and I watched by the bedside in turn, took our exercise upon the battlements, ate and slept with the regularity of automata. The life on one side was monotonous in the extreme, on the other it was filled with an unholy excitement that was the greater insomuch as it had been so carefully suppressed. To say that I was deeply interested in the work upon which I was engaged be by no means strong enough expression. The fire of enthusiasm to which I have alluded was raging once more in my heart, and yet there had been little enough so far in the experiment to excite it. With that regularity which characterized the whole of our operations, we carried on the work I have described. Every 6 hours saw the skin tighten and become elastic, the hue of the flesh change from white to pink, the veins recede, and the hollows fill, only to return to their original state as soon as the electric current was withdrawn. Towards the end of the fortnight, however, there were not wanting signs to show that the effect was gradually becoming more lasting. In place of doing so at once, the change to the original condition did not occur until some 8 or 10 minutes after the pads had been removed. And here I must remark that there was one other point on which the case struck me as peculiar. When I had first seen the old man, his fingernails were of that pale yellow tint so often observable in the very old. Now they were a delicate shade of pink, while his hair was, I felt convinced, a darker shade than it had been before. As Nikola was careful to point out, we had arrived at the most critical stage of the experiment. A mistake at this juncture would not only undo all the work we had accomplished, but, what was more serious still, might very possibly cost us the life of the patient himself. The night I am about to describe was at the end of the 14th day after our arrival at the castle. Nikola had been on watch from 4 o'clock in the afternoon until 8, when I relieved him. "Do not let your eyes wander from him for a minute," he said, as I took my place beside the bed. "From certain symptoms I have noticed during the last few hours, I am convinced the crisis is close at hand. Should a rise in the temperature occur, summon me instantly. I shall be in the laboratory, ready at a moment's notice to prepare the elixir upon which the success we hope to achieve depends." "But you are worn out," I said, as I noticed the haggard expression upon his face. "Why don't you take some rest?" "Rest!" he cried scornfully. "It's likely that I could rest with such a discovery just coming within my grasp. No, you need not fear for me. I shall not break down. I have a constitution of iron." Having once more warned me to advise him of any change that might occur, he left me. When I had examined my instruments, attended to the electrical apparatus, and taken the patient's temperature, I sat down to the vigil to which I had by this time become accustomed. Hour by hour I followed the customary routine. My watch was nearly at an end. In 20 minutes it would be time for Nikola to relieve me. Leaning over the old man, I convinced myself that no change had taken place in his condition. His temperature was exactly what it had been throughout the preceding fortnight. I carefully wiped the clinical thermometer and replaced it in its case. As I did so, I was startled by hearing a wild shriek in the hall outside. It was a woman's voice, and the accent was one of deadly terror. I should have recognised the voice anywhere. It was the Donna Consuelo's. What could have happened? Once more it rang out, and almost before I knew what I was doing, I had rung the bell for Nikola and rushed from the room to the hall outside. No one was to be seen there. I ran in the direction of the corridor which led towards the Donna's own quarters, but she was not there. I returned and followed that leading towards the terrible room behind the iron gate. The passage was in semi-darkness, but there was still sufficient light for me to see a body lying upon the floor. As I thought, it was the Donna Consuelo, and she had fainted. Picking her up in my arms, I carried her to the hall, where the meal of which I was to partake at the end of my watch was already prepared. To bathe her forehead was the work of a moment. She revived almost immediately. "What's the matter?" she asked faintly. "What has happened?" But before I could reply, the recollection of what she had seen returned to her. A look of abject terror came into her face. Save me, Dr. Ingleby," she cried, clinging to my arm like a frightened child. "If I see them again I shall go mad. It will kill me. You don't know how frightened I have been." I thought I was in a position to understand exactly. "Hush," I answered. "Try to think of something else. You are quite safe with me. Nothing shall harm you here." She covered her face with her hands, and her slender frame trembled under the violence of her emotion. 5 minutes had elapsed before she was sufficiently recovered to tell me everything. For some days, as I soon discovered, she had been left mostly entirely alone, and having nothing to occupy her mind, had been brooding over her enforced separation from her aged relative. The more she thought of him, the more intense became her craving to see him, in order to convince herself that no harm had befallen him. A semi-hysterical condition must have ensued, for she rose from her bed, dressed herself, and taking a candle in her hand, started in the hope of finding him. By some stroke of ill fortune she must have discovered a passage leading to Ah Win's portion of the castle, and at last found herself standing before the open door of that demon-haunted room. "What does it all mean?" she cried piteously. "What is this place, and why are those dreadful things here?" I was about to reply when the curtain at the end of the hall, covering the door of the laboratory, was drawn aside. To my horrified amazement, Nikola, whom I imagined had taken my place at the patient's room, stood before us. As I saw him and realized the significance of the position, a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. What construction would he be likely to place upon my presence there? For a few seconds he stood watching us. Then an expression I can only describe as being one of terror spread over his face. "What does this mean?" he cried hoarsely. "What have you done?" And then, running to the door of the Don's room, he drew back the curtain and entered. Leaving the Donna where she was, I followed with such fear in my heart as I had never known before. I found Nikola fumbling with the case of the clinical thermometer, and trembling like a leaf as he did so. Thrusting it into the old man's mouth, he hung over him and waited as if his whole life depended on the result. Withdrawing it again and holding up to the light, he gazed at it. "Too late," he cried, and I scarcely recognised his voice, so changed was it. "His temperature has dropped a point, Ingleby. This is your doing. For all you know to the contrary, you may have killed him." End of chapter 6.